Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie on Monday, November the 10th, 2025. In the past, I have talked about Zohran Mamdani, the mayor-elect of New York, but I think given he has been elected now, I think it would be a good time to have another look at his horoscope. There was some question about his time of birth. When I first looked at his chart, his time of birth was 1:15 a.m. for sure. Then I looked at it again, and then it wasn't so sure. It was speculative. And now I looked at it a last time, and yeah, he really was born at 1:15 a.m. So we do know his time of birth. And we also know that he's definitely going to be mayor of New York on January the 1st, assuming something absolutely dreadful doesn't happen. So I think it is a good opportunity to have one more look at his chart. But before I consider Zohran Mamdani, I want to focus on the astrology and the I Ching of today, which is Monday, November the 10th, 2025. And don't forget to like and subscribe if appropriate. So I don't think that there is a huge amount going on today. I know that tomorrow Jupiter goes stationary direct, so it is true that Jupiter is really coming to a standstill right now. But as far as the specifics of today are concerned, we have the Moon moving in sort of late Cancer, early Leo. So at noon New York time today on the 10th, the Moon is at 29:41 Cancer New York time. And so if you're in the Americas, then this morning the Moon is likely to be in late Cancer, though it does depend where you are. So if you are in California, for example, then relatively early in the day, the Moon will move into Leo. So I think that would be about sort of 9:34 in the morning. If you're in New York, it moves into Leo at 34 minutes past noon. 12:34 p.m. Now, if you are in Europe, it's not until late afternoon, early evening that the sign change happens. I make it, but it happens at 5:34 in the afternoon in London. So an hour later in sort of Paris or Rome or Berlin. If you're in Australia or New Zealand, then the Moon doesn't change sign until tomorrow. So as far as other things are concerned, aside from the sign change, the Moon is getting very close, or is very close, to a conjunction of Jupiter. Even after it changes sign and moves into Leo, it's still making that conjunction. You can see that Jupiter, which is going very, very slowly at the moment. In fact, Jupiter is at a standstill. Jupiter is stationary. And I think in tomorrow's video for Tuesday, I'll be looking at Jupiter going stationary retrograde, in detail. But so there is a Moon-Jupiter conjunction, and it's in Cancer. And Moon-Jupiter conjunction in Cancer, it is very fortunate. Moon is in its own sign. Jupiter is in the sign of its exaltation. Moon and Jupiter are in mixed reception. Moon is in Jupiter's exaltation sign. Jupiter is in the Moon's sign of rulership. So that is fortunate. It allows things to move pretty well, and there can be a certain feeling of happiness and contentment. Now, if you are in the Americas, I would take advantage of that Moon-Jupiter conjunction, as early as possible. I think you can still take advantage of it once the Moon has changed sign and has gone into Leo, because the Moon and Jupiter will still be pretty close to one another. But I would suggest, if you're in the Americas, that you have an early start. So if there are things you want to do, things that are important, then the sooner you get it, the sooner you get going, the better. Now, if you're in other parts of the world, then I think it's much easier to take advantage of that Moon-Jupiter conjunction. It's it's there, it's present, and if you want to do something, you're looking for favorable feedback, it can work, but you do have to remember that Mercury is now retrograde, and so with Mercury retrograde, things might not move quite as quickly as you'd like them to, and maybe some of us are still getting used to Mercury going retrograde, but nonetheless, I think that Moon-Jupiter conjunction, can help. Now, the Moon, when it does change sign, moves into Leo, it makes an opposition to Pluto. So that Moon opposition Pluto, shouldn't be ignored, and it might be that the day has a turn. It suddenly changes. It perhaps becomes quite light and fairly easygoing, but when it moves into Leo, there's something that has to be dealt with. Something is perhaps more serious than one had imagined, and the Moon, when it does move into Leo, it starts to make a T square. So Moon is opposition Pluto, and it is square Venus, and so especially in the Americas, you might feel that T square. Now Moon opposition Pluto square Venus, that might say something about relationships, for example. Perhaps you had assumed that one particular relationship was going to be easier than expected, or you thought someone was going to be quite relaxed about something, and in reality, they take things seriously, uncomfortably seriously. So that is a possibility. But overall, I'm not saying that a huge amount of stuff is going on today. And as far as Australia is concerned, setting the chart for Sydney, Australia, rather than New York. Here's the positions of a planets set for noon. You can see the Moon is at 20 degrees 23 in Sydney, Australia. 23 degrees 23, so 20 degrees 23 minutes Cancer. So if you are in Australia or New Zealand, then you really do get that Moon-Jupiter conjunction, right in the central part of the day. So I know that Mercury is retrograde, but if you are in Australasia, there are things you can take advantage of, and it could be, quite a fortunate day. And I think that you can sidestep, any complications, or maybe those complications will be more about tomorrow. And then there is the heliocentric view, putting the Sun at the center of the solar system. Not a huge amount going on. I think that the main thing happening is the sextile between Venus and Mars. You can see that Venus is at 1532 Libra, Mars is at 1455 Sagittarius. So, when you look at the heliocentric chart, the outer planets are going to be relatively close to where the planets are geocentrically. So you can see that, Saturn, you've got Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Aries, that's pretty close to where Saturn and Neptune are geocentrically. Likewise, Pluto, even further out, the further out you get, the closer it is to where the planets are geocentrically. And so Pluto at 3 degrees 5 Aquarius is not so far from where Pluto is geocentrically, just a degree or two. And even Mars, being an outer planet, it's in Sagittarius. It's still quite a few degrees away from its geocentric position, but just a reminder of how the heliocentric planets fall. But when you look at Mercury and Venus, they are going to be all over the place. Mercury is in Aries, heliocentrically. It's in Sagittarius, geocentrically. Anyway, this this Venus-Mars sextile, it's not a bad aspect. It is about how we can get on with people, and there is always a way to get on with people. If we make the effort, and that is perhaps what we are being encouraged to do with this aspect. And the universe The universe does say something about changing trends, changing patterns, and there is always a way to be attractive. And this Venus sextile Mars is saying, if you choose that way, if you align yourself with the universe, and things happen, on a day-to-day level. This is a fast-moving aspect, so what works today, Monday, might not work on Friday, but with this Venus sextile Mars, there's always a way. There's always a way to get people's attention in a favourable sense. So now it's time to look at things from the viewpoint of the 12 signs. So these are my forecasts for the 12 signs for today, which is Monday, November the 10th, 2025. Aries. It's maybe a somewhat split day, especially if you're in the Americas. I think during the first part of the day, you're not necessarily going to feel particularly active. You're not going to sort of want to shout from the rooftops. You're just going to want to continue with maybe whatever you were doing over the weekend. I mean, I know it's Monday, beginning of a working week, but maybe you don't feel that motivated, and that doesn't mean though that nothing can happen. There is a conjunction between the Moon and Jupiter, and this Moon-Jupiter conjunction in Cancer, Aries, could be something that is quite lucky for you. It is grounding, and you can be reassured. And so if there's something that you're worried about, that you don't know about, something that's bothering you, then perhaps the Moon-Jupiter conjunction in Cancer can reassure you that really things are okay, that they're that whatever concerns you have, there is always a way around it. And so try to focus on that conjunction between Moon and Jupiter, regardless of where you are, because it is fortunate. Both planets in Cancer, both the Moon and Jupiter, do very well in Cancer, and furthermore, you can you can bring things down to earth, and you don't have to be drifting off on flights of fantasy. But then, in the end, the Moon does change sign, and that moves into Leo. And during the last half of the day in the Americas, perhaps in the evening, if you're in Europe, or Africa, you notice that perhaps things become more interesting. There's more dynamism, there's more buzz. That's because the Moon is moving into Leo. And so, Moon moving into Leo, it's starting to make a sextile aspect between, Mercury and Venus. And Mercury and Venus are in Sagittarius. You've got Moon in Leo, so you start to see, what can be done, and you perhaps start to think about yourself and what matters to you. And with the Moon making an opposition to Pluto, you could perceive that as being a struggle that perhaps didn't exist at the beginning of the day. So what kind of struggle would that be? Well, you have things that are important to you. They matter. They're things that you want to put all your effort and your energy into. But you're perhaps also aware that other people, maybe society at large, have different ideas. And so doing what's important to you as the day progresses may become more of a struggle. You may have to fight for it more. And perhaps you might perceive there as being sort of outside forces telling you what you should do, telling you what you shouldn't be doing, and that's going to bother you. And I think that probably the best approach is to just hold true to what is important to you. And if it's important to you, if it's really important to you, then the question is, do you really have to fight about it? And I suspect that the answer is no. Now, as far as being combative, Mercury is making a conjunction to Mars. Now, you can see the conjunction between Mercury and Mars is getting closer and closer. Mercury, now retrograde, is moving towards Mars. Mars is, of course, not going retrograde, so Mercury and Mars are really quite quickly moving towards that conjunction. So the Mercury-Mars conjunction might be about you feeling that you have no choice. You have to say something. You have to express your feelings and your opinions. And every Aries has opinions. And you have an opinion on other people. You have an opinion on what's going on in the world, and you don't really want to keep it to yourself. And the question then is it necessarily the right time to say what's on your mind? Mercury is going retrograde. It's in Sagittarius. Mercury in Sagittarius retrograde can certainly jump to conclusions, and it's possible, Aries, that you just say something that just shouldn't be said. I mean, it might make you feel better short term to get something off your chest, but I'm not sure if that's necessarily going to work out in quite the way you'd imagined. And there are many ways of doing things. And when I looked at the heliocentric chart, I pointed out that Venus is making a sextile to Mars. And this sextile between Venus and Mars, okay, it was exact over the weekend. It's losing some of its strength, but it's still in operation. And this Venus sextile Mars can work for you. And remember, Venus Mars as a pair is about being attractive. It's about getting people onto your side, getting your way, through subtle methods, perhaps through charm, through charisma. And so that is the way. So if there's something bothering you, remind yourself that there is a sextile between Venus and Mars, and what's going on is that the cosmos is telling you that there is a right way and there's a wrong way, and the direct and obvious way is probably inappropriate. On the other hand, if you just use your charm, even if you're dealing with someone you strongly disagree with, someone you may find them even abhorrent, if that's possible, even in that situation, you can get your way, but without having to really exhaust yourself with aggressive energy. That is something that you want to avoid. And with this Venus sextile Mars heliocentrically, it goes without saying that if you're with people that you're getting on with and you want to get on better with them, you can. And so that means that Venus sextile Mars can be quite useful for relationships, for intensifying relationships, finding new ways of relating, and perhaps seeing certain relationships in a new way, and perhaps taking things to an enhanced level. So it's important, Aries, whatever you're doing today, that you're aware of the planetary energies, and you just utilize it, and timing may be important. Remember that the moon is in Cancer at the beginning of the day, it's in Leo at the end of the day, so there may be a turn over the course of the day, and perhaps you start the day being relatively cautious, but by the end of the day you can be perhaps more of a usual Aries extrovert. Taurus. I was just talking to Aries, and I was pointing out to Aries that there is a heliocentric sextile between Venus and Mars. And this sextile is it's not necessarily a hugely important aspect, but it's an aspect that you can utilize. Just to remind you, here is the Venus sextile Mars. There is Venus in heliocentric Libra. Remember, it's a heliocentric sextile, not a geocentric sextile. So there's Venus and there's Mars, so they're making the sextile aspect, and this is important to you because it says something about how you present yourself, how you can present yourself, and perhaps it gives you choices. Because from a geocentric perspective, if we go back to the geocentric view, Venus is in Scorpio, Venus is your ruler, and you could argue, that Venus in Scorpio is, maybe, not the best place for Venus to be. But then when you look at things heliocentrically, things don't look so bad. And with Venus in Scorpio, maybe I'm being too harsh on Venus in Scorpio. Venus in Scorpio is in your opposite sign, because Venus rules Taurus. It's in Scorpio. Scorpio's opposition Taurus, and so that does say something about relationships, how you get on with people. And there is a way. There is always a way. And the way to do it is to understand, what makes people tick, and you can do it. I mean, I know that you have your own ideas, and perhaps the most straightforward approach is just to move forward with whatever is important to you. But if you just completely ignore the social dimension, and you ignore other people's views, the way other people are, then it's going to be very difficult to get anything done. On the other hand, if you accept that Venus is in Scorpio, accept that to a greater extent you have to listen and feel, then it's going to be much easier. And with this Venus sextile Mars from a heliocentric view, then that really does show you the way forward. It does indicate that you can be a really pleasant person. You know how to be pleasant. Okay, it might be that you're being pleasant through gritted teeth, but it's the impression that counts. And if you make the effort, I do think that you can make a very good impression. And maybe you're going to be helped by the fact that the moon is making a conjunction to Jupiter. Moon making a conjunction to Jupiter means that you, I think, can present yourself very well. Your words can be quite effective. You can ground your words, and you can almost craft your words so that they do hit the mark, and people are going to be quite impressed, quietly impressed, by what you have to say. And slowly, with Venus sextile Mars heliocentrically, you maybe can start to move things in your direction. But don't be in a hurry. Things do take time. Now the moon does change sign. The moon moves into a Leo. Quite when moon moves into Leo depends. If you're in California, it will be this morning, Monday morning. If you're in Australia or New Zealand, well, it won't be until early tomorrow. But the moon in Leo, it is different. I mean, it's fairly grounding, and it reminds you of what is important to you and what does matter. And when the moon moves into Leo, it makes an opposition to Pluto. And this opposition to Pluto, it is about perhaps a challenge. And the challenge is to think about what is important, to think about what makes you secure, but also to think about what's happening out there. What kind of pressures exist in the outside world? Maybe these pressures exist from a career perspective, or some other way in which you've recently been trying to sort of move forward in the world. And when you try to move forward in the world, things can happen. It's always easier to stay where you are, because that means you don't have to take risks. But taking risks is perhaps part of being alive, and having to interact with people, not exactly knowing what they're going to say. And so that moon opposition Pluto could be a challenge, especially as the moon, when it moves into Leo, it starts to make a square to Venus. And that moon square Venus, okay, might not really be operational until right at the end of the day and into tomorrow, but moon square Venus means that you've got to balance, on one hand, yourself and your own views on your own stance, and on the other hand, you've got to deal with the reality of other people. Other people are different. They have a different view. And the problem with moon square Venus is that there could be a growing clash. And it's not the kind of clash that will necessarily be spoken, but it could be more of an emotional clash. You just realize that you and someone else apparently have a different stance. You have a different approach. You're at odds with one another. And yeah, maybe that nothing is said, but it's still there. And so, Taurus, don't be too stuck in your own ways and too opinionated, or believe that you don't want to budge for anyone. I think that stubbornness on your part would not be very helpful, but I think with this T square involving moon opposition Pluto with Venus on the T, I think there is some danger of stubbornness, and so this is why it's important that you have some flexibility, especially at the end of the day. Gemini. So Mercury is now retrograde, and Mercury is not in the greatest position. I mean, it's not just retrograde, it's in Sagittarius, and it's moving towards a conjunction of Mars. And I think there is reason to think that conjunction, that conjunction to Mars may not always be helpful. I mean, Mars, it sounds an exciting planet, but one should not forget that Mars is a malefic. It might be the lesser malefic, Saturn being the greater malefic, but it still has a malefic influence. And so with Mercury moving towards a conjunction of Mars, and I think that conjunction between Mercury and Mars is exact. I think it's exact tomorrow, November the 11th. So, it's Mercury, Mars. No, it's exact. It's exact on Wednesday, but it's still very close. And that Mercury-Mars conjunction can make you angry, just can make you annoyed, can make you irritated. Even if you're not actually having an argument with someone, it doesn't take much to make you irritated. And when you feel irritated, you might think that you're keeping your irritation to yourself, that other people aren't noticing, but I think they probably are. And don't forget, I should make it clear, I'm a Gemini, so I'm not just saying something random. I understand this, and I'm aware of it for myself. I mean, but one shouldn't exaggerate this. Remember, I'm just talking about a possibility. It doesn't mean to say that you will get angry, that it's always going to be bad. There are many ways of looking at this conjunction between Mercury and Mars, but you just have to be aware, Gemini, that things aren't as good as they could be, and you do have weaknesses and you do have vulnerabilities, and they're the kind of weaknesses which manifest through your own actions, and that is the nature of misfortune. Not always. I mean, sometimes terrible things happen to people and they've done absolutely nothing to deserve them. They just come out of the blue. But very often, if you look at people's misfortunes, they all start with that person making a mistake. It might be a financial mistake. Sometimes decisions really matter. You have options. You can make one decision, you can make the other decision, you can make no decision at all, but you make a decision which in retrospect makes no sense at all, but you just do it. And as a result of that decision, one thing leads to another, and it can lead to ruin. Okay, I'm not saying Mercury-Mars conjunction is going to lead to ruin, but just be aware that you could make mistakes over the next few days. Well, you could say that you could make mistakes longer than a few days' time. I mean, Mercury continues to be in a poor position, arguably, and for the rest of the year. I mean, I would need to qualify that, but perhaps I'll be talking about that at a later stage in another video. So if you are deciding something, even if it is apparently quite trivial, just consider the possibility that you've got it all wrong. And perhaps the biggest trap for you, Gemini, is to get angry. I'm not saying you will get angry, but if you do get angry, then that could lead to a situation, or it could lead to decisions that one thing leads to another, and it might not work out for you. And you also have to think very hard about the various relationships you're in. Mercury-Mars conjunction is a relationship-orientated aspect because it is in Sagittarius, your opposite sign, and just the things you do, the things you say. You might think you're being provoked. You're just defending yourself. You're just giving your viewpoint, but sometimes it's giving your viewpoint is not the right thing to do. There is a place for silence and not telling everyone what they feel. As a Gemini, you think, oh well, openness is the way forward, but it's not. Openness is not always the way forward. So I'm sorry to be rather pessimistic. I mean, it's not the only thing going on today. I mean, and the Mercury-Mars conjunction is not exact till Wednesday. And so aside from that, there is a Moon-Jupiter conjunction. This Moon-Jupiter conjunction, maybe it's going to be particularly strong early in the day if you're in the Americas. If you're in Australia or New Zealand, you really have the Moon-Jupiter conjunction really all day long. But, that is a fortunate aspect. And the Moon-Jupiter conjunction may say something about money, how you make money, what you do with money, decisions about money. Well, I'm not going to talk about decisions about money. I've just said a lot about Mercury-Mars, about the Mercury-Mars conjunction. But so I think you have to be careful about all your decisions. But still, I think the Moon-Jupiter conjunction means that good luck is available if you know where to look, or if you give something a go without taking risks. I'm certainly not advocating that you take risks today, but it's more about seeing an opportunity and being ready to take advantage of it. Cancer. I think Cancer, it can be quite a good day, particularly the beginning of the day. At the beginning of the day, things should be moving pretty quickly, or rather at your own pace. However you want to run things, that can be how it all works out. And in general, you'll come over as being quite an easygoing, relaxed person. Sorry about the dog. I don't know what the dog's barking about, but I'm sure it's something important, but maybe not so important that I'm going to stop the video. So with this Moon-Jupiter conjunction, if you are lucky, and you should be lucky. I mean, Jupiter is still in your sign. It will be in your sign until early summer of next year, and Jupiter might be slowing down. It's about to go retrograde, but still, this Moon-Jupiter conjunction allows you to project yourself in a fortunate way. People are going to appreciate you, and if there's anything you want, then I think you can get it, but in a way that I think is fairly natural. I don't think you don't have to push things. Now, the moon does change sign over the course of the day, and certainly if you're in the Americas, it changed sign quite early in the day. I mean, in New York, that would be 12:34 p.m. Around lunchtime, even before lunchtime. If you're in California, British Columbia, Oregon, the moon changes sign at I think 9:34 a.m. Even earlier in Hawaii or Alaska. So certainly if you're in the Americas, you have this sign change, moon moving into Leo, and maybe that means that things will become more complicated. There will be things that you just have to take into account. That there's really no choice. Now those complications may say something about money. Not necessarily the kind of money that you really want to think about, but it's still there, and you're trying to deal with a situation that is just made complicated, perhaps by other people. It may not be you that has created a complicated financial situation, but maybe other people have been concerned about power. And the moon, when it moves into Leo, it doesn't just make an opposition to Pluto. It makes a square to Venus, and so in other words, that means that you've got a T square. So with this T square, there is the question about how do you deal with it, and if something is complicated, what do you do, and what is your response? Well, Venus is on the T. Venus in Scorpio is on the T. So perhaps you should be thinking about that Venus in Scorpio, and maybe the Venus in Scorpio is telling you not necessarily to take things too seriously. You could take something seriously, perhaps because you regard it as being a security threat. But with Venus on the T means that you have to think about it from your own perspective, not anyone else's perspective. And if you do things your way, you do things how you feel is right, and you do it like that, then I think that things will start to resolve. And I think it's also going to be important that you get on with it, whatever you want to do, and you don't worry too much about what other people are saying, and perhaps your own financial concerns. Yeah, sure, you've got to always be interested in money. You're a Cancerian. I mean, Cancer is a sign that never ignores the financial dimension, but you don't want to become obsessed about it. And there you've got your moon opposition Pluto. Moon opposition Pluto can be quite an obsessive aspect. But I think that if you think about what is important to you and the way you are, and about your own sense of balance, then I think that you should be okay. Leo, the moon does eventually move into your sign. Quite when, it depends where you are. I mean, the moon doesn't move into Leo until tomorrow if you're in Australia or New Zealand. But if you're in the Americas, it moves into your sign, pretty early on, certainly by lunchtime. If you're in the East Coast, if you're in California, then just after 9:30 in the morning, at 9:34 a.m. So moon moving into Leo is certainly something that you should be happy about, up to a point. There are a few complications of moon moving into Leo, but having a moon in your sign, having a moon in a fire sign, does give you a boost. And with the moon moving out of Cancer, you can be yourself, and you can do the things that you enjoy doing. And if anyone is preventing you from enjoying yourself, well, maybe you can do something about it. But it's not just about moon and Leo. At the beginning of the day, the moon is in Cancer, and if you're in Australia or New Zealand, the moon will be in Cancer all day long. And so there might be a time where you just need to pause and collect your thoughts, and not feel that you immediately have to take action. There is a time for slow consideration. And with the moon making a conjunction to Jupiter, that perhaps is telling you that the good fortune, if there is any good fortune, there's no reason why there shouldn't be good fortune, but fortunate things can be found in hidden places. You don't have to be out and about to get lucky. You can get lucky in your own private world. And that is especially the case if you're in Australia and New Zealand, when you've got that Moon Jupiter conjunction, all day long, pretty much. But when the Moon does move into Leo, on one hand, you're certainly strengthened. You have a strong sense of who you are, and what you want to do, and what you want to achieve, and how you want to present yourself. But the Moon does make an opposition to Pluto, and it makes a square to Venus. So with those aspects, one immediately starts to think about relationships. Pluto is in Aquarius; it's in your opposite sign. Venus is a natural planet of relationships. So with the Moon making those two aspects, in fact, making a T-square, it just could be, Leo, that the area of relationships, may seem somewhat complicated, and you can see how other people, in some respects, hold some of the cards, if not all of the cards. So you may not be quite as powerful as you'd like to be when you are in a one-to-one situation. When you're not in a one-to-one situation, that's fine. I don't think there are any real issues of power. But you might just be aware of how power works. And you then have to ask yourself, is this real, or is this your imagination? And that is one of the challenges of Pluto moving into Aquarius. I mean, I know that Pluto has been in Aquarius for some time, but Aquarius is a sign that is very important to you. You could argue that that Leo and Aquarius are just a polarity, but we shouldn't be thinking about 12 signs. We should be thinking about 6 polarities, and the polarity for you is Leo Aquarius. And perhaps you've got your hidden Aquarius, your inner Aquarius that is trying to be noticed. And with Pluto moving into Aquarius, you're being encouraged to tune into something that you normally want to ignore, that you normally want to run away from. And so with Moon opposition Pluto, and indeed Venus is still square Pluto and Moon square Venus, your ability to tell stories about what is going on, especially on a social and interpersonal level, is quite strong. And so if you have a story that you want to tell yourself about what a relationship is about, I mean, that's a very nice story, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the story is true. And there could be a lot of exaggeration, and perhaps you've given someone some power that they don't just, don't have, but they don't even want it. Virgo. Mercury is important. It has to stay important. And, the reason for that is, okay, Mercury's just gone retrograde. We've already talked about that when I did the video for the weekend. But, Mercury is in Sagittarius, and it is making a conjunction to Mars. And, because of all of this, some Virgos, might have a bit of a siege mentality. You can see what's going on around you, and what's going on around you is not necessarily easy. There are things to deal with. There are things to protect yourself from, and you have to make sure that your part of the world, that small part of the world that you have control over, or you hope you have control over, is as secure as possible. And that might be how you see it. And as far as you're concerned, there may be times when you do have to defend yourself. I'm not saying you do have to defend yourself, but from your perspective, it might seem like that. And with Mercury making a conjunction to Mars, Mars is an aggressive planet. And this conjunction is getting close. I know that it's Monday, and the Mercury-Mars conjunction is not exact until Wednesday, but it is close. It's really close. Just 2 degrees apart, and it is an aggravating factor. And it doesn't take much to get you annoyed at the moment. Okay, you may not express your annoyance, but I think it's still there. And you kind of have this sort of dilemma. Maybe it's a sort of almost like a catch-22 situation. If you are feeling that the world is difficult, then the temptation would be to stay where you are. Obviously, why take the risk? But if you stay where you are, then it's not like that Mercury-Mars conjunction is disappearing. You're still taking it with you. So you stay where you are, and you just get annoyed about something. Your mind is moving quickly, and it's difficult to know when to stop. And there's just a lot of things to irritate. So to irritate you. So you could say, oh well, and instead do the opposite. Go out into the world. Don't stay in one place. But of course, if you go out into the world, you don't stay in one place. Then that creates a new set of problems. You might be thinking that you are vulnerable and that you perhaps have to defend yourself, and you have to look after your interests, all the more. So, I think it's important, Virgo, that you don't exaggerate in any way, shape, or form. That you do get things, in perspective. And, just because you perceive a conflict doesn't mean that conflict necessarily exists. And I think that with Mercury making a conjunction to Mars, it would be a good idea if you had something that you just focused on, something perhaps that you are quite good at. You just give it everything you've got, and you don't feel any need to be surrounded by other people. There is a part of you, Virgo, at the moment that does want to be alone. Greta Garbo, she said that, didn't she? And I think Greta Garbo was a Virgo, so maybe you can sort of tune in your inner Greta Garbo with that, wanting to be alone. I mean, that is fine. And I think if you are alone, just try to be happy being alone. And you don't have to feel that you're doing it as a way of getting away from other people, having to spend a lot of time protecting yourself. I don't think you do. When you're alone, you can be yourself, and you can, as I've just said, you can harness something that you're good at. Give it your best shot, but also, don't do anything dangerous, don't do anything careless, don't make decisions. It is a bad time to make decisions. And, if you were to make decisions, I think, there's a good chance that, those decisions would go wrong. Perhaps you hadn't got enough information, or you rushed into something because you wanted to make things simple. So you decided you were going to go in one direction, you were going to give it everything you've got, but it doesn't work out. And again, Mercury is retrograde. So when Mercury is retrograde, Virgo, you have to be careful, especially now, when Mercury is really, I'm afraid, not well placed. It happens to everyone. And just because Mercury is badly placed in theory, it doesn't mean to say bad things are going to be happening. It just means that you have to be aware of some of the limitations being placed upon you, but don't exaggerate those limitations, and don't necessarily assume that those limitations are other people's fault. Libra, I think it's very important today that you do concentrate on the positives. So the day starts with the moon in Cancer, and the moon is making a conjunction to Jupiter. Moon-Jupiter conjunction, is a great aspect, and all of us can take advantage of this Moon-Jupiter conjunction. Certainly, all Librans. And if you are an American Libran, then I would suggest that you start the day as early as possible. That is when the Moon-Jupiter conjunction is going to be at its strongest. If you are in Australia or New Zealand, I don't think there's quite that time pressure. But even if you are in America and you have a late start, still the Moon and Jupiter are pretty close to one another. Even once the Moon moves into Leo, because that's what's happening today. The Moon is moving from Cancer to Leo. So with this Moon Jupiter conjunction, this is a reminder that things can work for you. They can work very well for you, and if you want to be lucky, you can be lucky. Of course, you've got to decide where that luck is going to be, and there is that question: can you bring luck down through your own volition? I said, if you want to be lucky, you can be lucky. I mean, is that really true? Is that just over optimistic? I don't think it is over optimistic. If you're honest with yourself and you know what works, then you can certainly give it your best shot. And I think that you're going to be helped as well by the fact that Venus is making a heliocentric sextile to Mars. Not a geocentric sextile, but a heliocentric sextile. And with this heliocentric sextile between Venus and Mars, that says something about the way you present yourself. And being a Libran, you are aware of the importance of presentation, that you've got to sort of understand other people and other people's sensibilities, and you've got to make some effort to fit in. And with Venus sextile Mars, at some level you do know what people want, and you know perhaps what people find attractive and what people find ugly, and you can perhaps use that. So I think that you can today be quite effective, regardless of whether the Moon is in Cancer or the Moon is in Leo. But with that Moon Jupiter conjunction, it does stand out. And so if you want something, and you really try to go for it. And don't forget also that Jupiter is about to go stationary retrograde, and so with Jupiter going stationary retrograde, that might say something about your ambitions. What you're trying to achieve, because Jupiter is in a high-profile part of your chart, and so that moment when Jupiter goes retrograde, might be a moment of indecision. And I'll be talking more about it tomorrow. But with the Moon making a conjunction to Jupiter, that is a reminder that you can see it through. It doesn't matter if you're not 100% confident. You really can see it through to completion. And as far as the Moon moving into Leo, that does happen, in the end. And I think with the Moon moving into Leo, there's going to be a change of emphasis. So this change of emphasis, if you're in the Americas, it happens during the first part of the day, or New York time. Moon moves into Leo at I think 12:34 p.m. If you're in Europe, it may not be till late afternoon, early evening that the Moon moves into Leo. But when the Moon does move into Leo, perhaps you can be, I won't say more relaxed, because there are other things to consider, but perhaps your focus can change. Maybe it's not your immediate ambitions that matter, but it's more about wanting to fit in to some extent. I mean, it's important that you don't try too hard to fit in. I mean, you've got to think about yourself and your own needs. But when the Moon moves into Leo, it does start making a square to Venus, and it makes an opposition to Pluto. So when you're talking about Moon opposition Pluto, the concept of fitting in could be important. You might be aware of external pressure, and being a Libran, if you're aware of external pressure, you want to pay attention to it. You don't want to stand out too much. Yet the Moon is opposition Pluto. Pluto is in Aquarius. This is a time, Libra, when you need to be standing out, and you need to be showing other people what you really can do, because it's a time when you can take what you're good at and present it to a wider audience, and really get appreciated for that. Now, as a Libran, you might have your doubts. You might be thinking, well, is it really worth it? What might people say? people have got an assumption that you are this, that, and this and that, and they might, if they see something else, not be happy about it. But no, it's not a time to hide things. You have to show the world what you can do, and once you do show the world what you can do, I think that you'll realize how much you're being appreciated. Now, as far as the T square is concerned, Venus is your ruler, and this T square more of a feature of sort of the end of the day and perhaps into tomorrow. But this T square is about you perhaps being able to harness your abilities, whatever those abilities might be, and make them real, get them to be perhaps to be noticed, and also to be rewarded. And reward may be an important part of it. Maybe reward is something you hadn't really been thinking about, but if you're doing something well and it's taking you time, then you should be paid for it, and maybe that payment should be very real. Maybe it should have a financial nature. I mean, if you do something, and you make sure you're paid for it. So that could be how the T square works. And as far as relationships are concerned, well, I've talked about Venus sextile Mars, heliocentrically. I think that this Venus sextile Mars says a lot about how you present yourself, about you are quite capable of being attractive, and people just like you for what you are and the way you project yourself. But there's also a conjunction between Mercury and Mars, and this Mercury-Mars conjunction, okay, it's exact on Wednesday, but it's pretty exact now. And so as far as relationships are concerned, don't be surprised if some people have a lot to say for themselves, and they might speak with great passion, even with a bit of anger, and I don't think that's a problem, but it's something you should be ready for. So if you're greeted with a barrage of words over the next couple of days, don't be surprised, and don't be offended, and don't necessarily think that it means anything, or at least don't think that it means very much. Scorpio. Don't forget, Scorpio, that Mercury is getting quite close to a conjunction of Mars. And this conjunction is exact on Wednesday, but it's pretty close now. It's just a couple of degrees, Mercury and Mars. And so when you've got Mercury moving close to Mars, it does mean that you feel that something needs to be said. That doesn't mean that you're going to actually say anything, but at some level you want to express yourself, and if you can't express yourself, then you could get angry, and so what do you do? It's not always a good idea to be open. I know that openness is regarded as being good in our society. We shouldn't keep things to ourselves, but it really does matter how the words are put together, and it's possible that the words are put together wrong, especially with Mercury in what is frankly quite a bad state. I mean, Mercury is a planet of communication. It's retrograde, it's in Sagittarius, and it's making a conjunction to Mars. Now, there is this question about Mercury conjunct Mars, whether or not that's a bad aspect. From Mercury's perspective, it is a bad aspect, because Mercury is weakened by Mars. Mars is a malefic. It's a natural malefic. But on the other hand, from Mars's perspective, it perhaps is different. Mars is touched by Mercury, and Mercury is about what needs to be said. And so maybe, Scorpio, there is a right way to say things, but you have to be so careful. This is especially the case if you really are angry, or if you're annoyed, or you're expressing any irritation, because if you are irritated, that could so easily undermine what you're saying. You could use the wrong words. You could make sweeping statements. Because you're trying to make an impact, and sweeping statements can be very destructive. So if you have any doubts, then probably you should keep your thoughts to yourself, if you have any doubts. Or you should craft what you're going to say, and really, use your feelings to understand, what is the best way of presenting yourself, because there is a best way. And this Mercury-Mars conjunction may well have a financial dimension. And so you have to be particularly careful if you're talking about money. So if there's a financial issue that is worrying you, then the alarm bells should be ringing. Not because the financial issue is in itself necessarily bad, but because your response to it might be ill-judged. You could just reach the wrong conclusion, and perhaps also get your timing wrong. There's always a good time to talk about money, and there's a bad time. And if you get your timing wrong with a financial intervention, it can be worse and useless. I think that is always the case with money. But of course, there comes a point where certain financial matters have to be discussed. But if you can get your timing right, as far as is possible, I think that would be very good. And as far as the moon is concerned, we have to always think about the moon when we're doing these forecasts of the 12 signs. And the moon starts the day in Cancer, it ends the day in Leo. And if you're in Australia or New Zealand, the moon is in Cancer, all day long. But it's perhaps the moon in Leo we should be thinking about. The moon will be in Leo, goes into Leo in the Americas. Could be this morning. If you're in New York, it'll go into Leo. 12:34 p.m. if you're on Eastern Standard Time. And if you're in Europe or Africa, it might be late afternoon, early evening. But when the moon does move into Leo, something does change. I think that you do become more focused on the things that matter, and you might feel that something has to happen. And the moon, when it moves into Leo, does become part of a T-square, because the moon in Leo makes an opposition to Pluto, and it also makes a square to Venus. And suddenly you might be thinking, oh well, time is passing, that you could waste a lot of time if you are not careful, and that it's best to get going on things as really quickly. And so if there's an ambition you have, then moon in Leo, you might feel this is the time. You don't want to waste any more time. Let's just go for it. And if you handle yourself right, I think it can be fine. I think that you can get attention, not just today, but into tomorrow. And don't forget that Venus is making a heliocentric sextile to Mars. So that Venus making a sextile to Mars does give you the ability to give a good account of yourself, and to explain what is important to you. I think that you can do that, and I think that people will like you and they will find you attractive, and that's going to help you get your way. So that doesn't look too bad. And if you do find that there is a conflict situation, that people are just not getting on with one another, and that it seems to be a deadlock, then Venus in Scorpio can resolve the deadlock through your charm. Even if you don't feel charming, even if you feel that your words are clumsy, it doesn't matter. Through an attempt on your part, to show diplomacy, then you can solve the problem. And it needn't even be in a conflict situation. Just remember, Venus is in Scorpio. Venus is just at the beginning of Scorpio. And so with Venus in Scorpio in your own sign, you definitely have an ability to get people's attention and to come over as someone who is attractive, who can be, and perhaps even should be, taken seriously. Sagittarius. right now, Sagittarius, the moon is in the process of moving from one sign to another. It's moving from sort of late Cancer to early Leo, and really, it doesn't matter what sign the moon is in. There are still advantages in both. I mean, if the moon is in Cancer, it's very well placed. It's in its own sign. It's making a conjunction to Jupiter. You're hopefully, feeling good about yourself, and you are sensitive. I know that Sagittarius is sometimes treated as being a somewhat insensitive sign. I don't think that is necessarily true, but right now your sensitivity is in good form and it's in good shape, and so that's moon in Cancer conjunct Jupiter. Then the moon moves into Leo. Okay, it might not move into Leo until quite late in the day, even into tomorrow. But in the Americas, it moves into Leo, fairly early in the day. So when the moon moves into Leo, that's a change. Moon moving into a fire sign, you're starting to think about what is possible, and you can move beyond your subjectivity and your emotions and your growing emotional maturity, and you can move into something else, and you can move into a world where things are happening, where there is variety, where there is action, where there's energy. So it doesn't really matter what sign the moon is in. It all looks good, and I think it is a time when you feel that you do feel powerful and that you are moving in the right direction. Though you shouldn't forget that Jupiter is at a standstill. Jupiter's not moving anymore. And tomorrow Jupiter is that's when it is stationary retrograde. It happens at a precise time. And of course that matters, because Jupiter's your ruler. So if you want the precise time where Jupiter goes retrograde, I make it that Jupiter goes retrograde at London time 4:42 in the afternoon. So yeah, it doesn't matter where you are. Jupiter will go retrograde tomorrow or Tuesday. Could be very early on Wednesday if you're in Australia or New Zealand. But Jupiter going retrograde, I think, is an opportunity. It could give you pause. Maybe you're still trying to work out what it means for Jupiter to be in Cancer. So, some of the ways in which your emotions have developed have reached a point where you're wondering where things are going, and also how far do you want to go? How deeply do you want to go into something? Maybe there's a point where you don't want to go any further, and you want to start to think about how you're going to use your feelings, how you're going to use your insights. I mean, I don't want to go on too much about this, because tomorrow is the day that Jupiter goes retrograde. So I think I should perhaps save any thoughts and insights, and until tomorrow, when I do my horoscope for then. But still, I think it is a time when things are perhaps becoming clear for you, and when the moon moves into Leo, you get perspective, and perhaps perspective is what you need. It's all very well, you've got things happening perhaps at a quite deep level, but at a certain point you've got to sort of go out into the world and ask yourself, where's it all going? What's it all for? And one aspect that is starting to become quite important is the conjunction between Mercury and Mars. So this Mercury-Mars conjunction, that's exact on Wednesday, but Mercury and Mars, they're pretty close, and it's in your sign. And I think that already you're starting to feel this Mercury-Mars conjunction. And this Mercury-Mars conjunction is going to be particularly powerful if you are born, your ascendant or your sun or your moon are in the first decanate of Sagittarius. So, if you were, say, born in November, if you're looking at it from a perspective of the sun signs, if you're a November Sagittarian, or if your ascendant is before 10 degrees Sagittarius, or if you're looking at it from a lunar perspective, your moon before 10 degrees Sagittarius, then I think it will be more powerful. But I think every Sagittarius is going to feel this Mercury-Mars conjunction to some extent. And with this Mercury-Mars conjunction, it may be a time where you just feel that there are things that do need to be said. You've kept quiet for long enough, and maybe once a moon moves into Leo, once a moon moves into a fire sign, you'll feel that this is a time. This is a time to be yourself. And with Mercury conjunct Mars, there is a certain danger of bluntness. Sagittarians can be blunt, and sometimes they can be too blunt, and you do have to pay some attention to other people's sensitivities. Mercury is weak right now. Mercury is retrograde. Mercury is in the sign of its detriment. And it's heading to a conjunction of Mars. And that weakness that I'm talking about, the weakness of Mercury, may be about the weakness of other people, the weakness of the people who you have to come into contact with. Maybe the weakness of loved ones, spouses, partners, being aware of that weakness. And so if you see someone else being angry and being annoyed, this is not a sign of strength. This is a sign of their own weakness and even helplessness, being in a situation where they just don't know how to respond, they don't know what to do. And so in this way, this Mercury-Mars conjunction might mean that you have to be sympathetic and perhaps tolerant. Other people might be behaving in a way that you don't like, but you have to ask, what is the reason for it? And if you can be conciliatory, I think that might be quite useful. Capricorn. I'm not saying that today is going to be particularly major. You can't expect every day to be super important. I think that by and large things will go to plan. I mean, there might have been things that you were a little bit concerned about. You were concerned perhaps about other people's responses, what other people were doing, what other people were saying, maybe because the moon was moving through Cancer, because the moon was moving through Cancer throughout the weekend, and so Cancer is your opposite sign, and so moon moving through Cancer can be about other people and perhaps exaggerating other people's importance. You still can't neglect people. I mean, they do matter, and the moon does make a conjunction to Jupiter, certainly at the beginning of the day. And so with this moon conjunct Jupiter, that perhaps means that in some small way you can benefit from other people's presence, and you can at the same time show some understanding. But it's pretty low profile. I don't think that it's necessarily that important. And as the day progresses, Capricorn, you may feel that you need to withdraw a little. That you've seen enough. You've done enough. You don't necessarily want to get involved. I mean, that might be your general view. Perhaps because that if you were to get involved, things could become complicated very quickly, because the moon does move into Leo. It could be tomorrow if you're in Australia or New Zealand, but when the moon moves into Leo, maybe things become more complicated. Things have the potential to become more complicated, but that doesn't mean to say that they have to become more complicated. If you are detached and distant, then where the complication is going to come from. I don't think they're going to come from anywhere. On the other hand, if you, for whatever reason, feel that you have to get involved with other people and their dramas and their concerns, and then things could become difficult, and I don't know. I don't think it's a good time to be socializing. Part of you wants to socialize, but it's not worth it. I think when you're with other people, that's kind of asking for trouble. It's just asking for things just to happen, or things to be said that you just don't necessarily want to deal with. Although, having said all this, Capricorn, I do think that you're certainly able to look after yourself. You are in, I would have said, quite a strong position, especially if you're being pushed. If you're being pushed, straight away, you know what's important. You know how to look after yourself, and you do know how to project yourself and your desires and what is important to you. So you're not someone who is going to be ignored. I mean, once you make the effort, if you want to make the effort, I'm not saying you should make the effort, but once you start making the effort to be sociable, to be there in other people's presence, you can make things happen, and you can force people to pay attention to you. But I just don't think it's anything that you're necessarily going to want to be bothered with. I mean, why? And you've got your own thoughts. There is a conjunction between Mercury and Mars forming over the next couple of days. It's exact on Wednesday, so there is a lot for you to think about, but I don't think that you necessarily want to share these thoughts. Maybe these are things that you want to work out on your own, or maybe you're not happy about your thoughts, and you can certainly be quite critical and negative in your own way, when you're thinking about things privately. And what happens when you actually reveal these thoughts? Well, you'll certainly get a reaction, and as I've said, you are powerful, but maybe you feel that you don't want to actually use this power. Aquarius. At the moment, Aquarius, we have the moon in Cancer. It starts the day in Cancer, and then it moves into Leo. We should probably be more concerned from an Aquarian perspective with the moon moving into Leo, and so the moon does move into Leo this morning, for example, if you're in California, lunchtime in New York, late afternoon, early evening in Europe, maybe not until tomorrow if you're in Australasia. But when the moon moves into Leo, of course, it is moving into your opposite sign. And when the moon moves into Leo, it makes an opposition to Pluto. It also makes a square to Venus. So that means that we have a T-square. Even before the moon moves into Leo, while it's in very late Cancer, it's starting to form this T-square. So perhaps this T-square is the main thing going on today. And this T-square could well be about you and other people, and how you relate to them, and who is in control. When the moon moves into Leo, Leo being your opposite sign, you might then think that you have to pay attention to other people. Other people demand your attention. Your moon in Leo. Leo is quite an attention-orientated sign. And the question then is, do you want to pay attention to anyone? Moon opposition Pluto can be about you wanting to be self-sufficient, you wanting to be independent, and so why should you bother? It's perhaps best to ignore what's being said and not have to worry about external pressure. But I think that would be a shame, because you mustn't forget that we do have a T-square here. It's not just involving the moon and Pluto, it also involves Venus. And when you look at a T-square in astrology, you should probably regard Venus as the key. Venus is what unlocks the whole thing. And with Venus in Scorpio, that means that you can turn things round, through the power of your being and your general charisma and the way you present your personality. You can change things completely, and you can take a somewhat difficult social situation, a situation that you maybe find annoying, and you can turn it round very much to your advantage. And it could well be that when you look at your ambitions, I mean, I've been talking a lot about your ambitions over the last few weeks. Your ambitions do matter. And you shouldn't think when the moon moves into Leo, the moon will be in Leo for a couple of days. You shouldn't think that the moon in Leo is about just someone being annoying. It's about people being there who can help you. And maybe what you need to do is you need to change the situation, even like revolutionize the situation, look at things in a new way. And it just could be that a person who you thought was a problem could be, a real advantage. They could really help you out if you are able to really understand another person, in a new way. And your ability to create change and transformation right now, Aquarius, is very strong. So if you don't like the way things are around you, you don't have to put up with it. You just change it. And it's not about getting involved in some kind of conflict. It's just about you presenting yourself, with maximum power. And you don't have to be aggressive. You just have to believe in yourself and have an idea about how you want things to unfold. And I think that that means, Aquarius, it can be a very powerful day, and things can really work in your favor. Pisces. Mercury and Mars are starting to make a conjunction. And this conjunction between Mercury and Mars, it's exact on Wednesday. But it's getting close, and I think you should perhaps be thinking about it. And this is especially the case if you're someone who is, ambitious. If there are things you want to happen, and if that is the case, then there is certainly a good way of using Mercury and Mars. The Mercury-Mars conjunction allows you to be very clear about what you want, and you're not going to want to put up with anyone trying to sort of get in your way, trying to hold you back. That's not what you're interested in, and you're going to be able to argue very well, provided you're careful. Remember, Mercury is in a weak position. It is retrograde, it's in Sagittarius, and it's conjunct Mars. And so there's always a possibility of getting your arguments wrong, saying things you shouldn't, getting your timing wrong. There's always that possibility. But on the other hand, this Mercury-Mars conjunction, it's very strong. And, sometimes people are looking for opinions. They want people to be very clear. And you, Pisces, right now can be very clear. You just have to, use your feelings to just understand, what is the best approach. And at the same time, show an ability to understand, because Mercury could represent not you, but another person who is unsure of themselves, doesn't really know what they're doing. I mean, they might mean well, but they're kind of at sea, even though Mercury is in Sagittarius. And so this is going to be particularly important if you're going into work or if you have a business. There just may be one person who really stands out as being confused. They don't necessarily know what they're doing, and this person might have authority. They might well be an employer. Could be the case. And yeah, if they're making the wrong decisions, maybe you can be aware of this. And if you see that someone is making mistakes, is just being, over keen, then that's not just a warning sign. It's something you can do something about, and you will see it, and you're helped by the fact that you're a Pisces. And so that might be a way in which a Mercury-Mars conjunction is working. So while I think that you can start to realize your ambitions and talk about your ambitions and discuss what is important to you on a sort of a more material level, you're also aware of people who don't know what's good for them, who could be making mistakes. And if you have an employer or some authority figure who sounds very, very sure of themselves, then in a way that certainty is a warning sign. People who are sure of themselves are the ones who are most likely to make mistakes. And the question then is, how would you deal with that situation? And, the way you deal with that situation is to use a certain amount of subtlety. I mean, I think that you can be subtle. I mean, that's part of being a Pisces. You don't have to look at things directly. So that's perhaps something to be aware of. But I do get the feeling that it's although it sounds like a problem, it could be something that you can turn around and you can actually take advantage of the situation. And by the way, that Mercury-Mars conjunction over the next couple of days may say something about relationships in general. It could be that someone close to you is under the weather, is perhaps got low self-esteem, has got ideas which aren't necessarily very sensible, and they might be annoyed, and an annoyance can be a response to a difficulty. If someone is feeling bad about themselves, they can show annoyance and they can get angry, and so in relationships, be very careful about the other person, particularly if it's a close relationship, and if they're behaving in a strange way, then I think you'll know what it's about. It is about the weakness of Mercury, and because Mercury is conjunct Mars, just don't be surprised if people express themselves in ways which aren't very helpful, and don't take it to heart. And you can use your Piscean wisdom perhaps to diffuse the situation. And those are my forecasts for the 12 signs. And it is now time to look at things from the viewpoint of the I Ching. So I ask the question, what is Monday going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was hexagram number 1, which is the creative. Creative, it is a powerful hexagram. It's the first hexagram, and it represents pure positivity. It's the beginning of action, and it's a kind of action we don't really even know what it is, because it's so raw, it's so primal, and it's not a time to respond. It's a time to go with the action, to go with the energy. And the animal one associates with the creative is the dragon. And the dragon is seen as this really creative force, which is now sort of becoming sort of unleashed. And this hexagram has 3 lines, and 3 moving lines. The bottom line moves, the third from a bottom moves, and the fourth from a bottom moves. And with the bottom line moving, we are certainly aware that something is going on, that something is changing. We can really feel it. But to begin with, we do have to allow things to develop. It takes a bit of time for them to unfold, and perhaps we have to let the dragon wake up. But whatever we're thinking, it's just not quite the time. And I'm wondering whether this might relate to the fact that we've got a conjunction between Mercury and Mars. So this Mercury-Mars conjunction, which I've been talking about quite a lot in this video, it's exact tomorrow, on Wednesday. And Mercury and Mars might be, particularly in Sagittarius, might be about sort of revealing something, showing, who we are, what we believe in. But as I've been suggesting, for some of the signs, it might not be the right time. And so we might feel that there's something we have to communicate, something we have to say, something we have to initiate, and we want to do it as quickly as possible. But doing it straight away might not be the right approach. And then the third line moves. So with the third line moving, we are upping the pace. We are active. There are going to be times in the day when we really are moving with things. Perhaps we're working hard, whatever. And we're still aware that things could go wrong. We're not being naive at all. And even when we stop working, there's still things bothering us. And what the I Ching tells us, or the symbolism the I Ching gives us, is of someone working all day, and when they go home at night, they're still worried. Their mind is still ticking away. And the I Ching is saying, well, actually, that's not a bad thing. It's good to be cautious. And then the fourth line moves. And there are a number of ways of looking at the fourth line. Now, the fourth line could be seen as being a choice. We have made, with the fourth line, when you're dealing with the I Ching, you've got two sets of three lines. You've got the bottom three lines and you've got the top three lines. So you've got each hexagram of 6 lines contains 2 trigrams. And the thing about the fourth line is it is that transition. You've transitioned from the bottom trigram to the top trigram. So the question is, what are you going to do? You have paused. You're aware of the dangers, but you are ready for the transition. So what do you do? And the Wilhelm translation sort of indicates that there might be a choice, that we could take the initiative, the creative. That's certainly open to us. Or we decide to take the alternative path. We distance ourselves from the whole thing, and maybe we've got a choice. But another way of looking at it with the fourth line is it's about a leap. You have made a leap. You've leapt from the bottom trigram to the top trigram. So who is doing the leaping? Well, the dragon is doing the leaping. So we are the dragon. We make that leap. We've stayed still. We've contemplated things. We were aware of danger. We're nervous. We're not sure whether it's going to work. And the I Ching is saying, in the end, do the leap, take the jump. By the way, I'm not saying you should take the jump. You have to look at the situation you're in. But if you are in a situation where you're pausing, or whether should you do it, should you not do it, well, then the I Ching is saying you should. Though we shouldn't forget the astrology, of course. Astrologically, I've gone on and on about Mercury being retrograde and Mercury not being a great position, saying, well, we shouldn't make decisions. We should, put them on ice, maybe until Mercury is direct, or maybe until the beginning of next year. So you have to balance it all out. But there is this possibility that the I Ching is talking about, that it might be time to make that leap. To make your position clear and to really continue, with the creative process. And then, because you've got 3 lines moving, we move to a second hexagram. And the second hexagram is rather different. It is hexagram number 59. So this hexagram is dispersion. So with the first hexagram, the creative, a very active hexagram, moving forward. Dispersion is about the rains. The rains come along and they just wash everything away. It is kind of like the power washer hexagram. Total turmoil. It seems absolutely scary. Now, it could be, with the previous hexagram, the creative, what we have been doing is almost bringing on the rains through our actions. we have been creating the conditions where it can rain, and not just rain. I mean, we're talking dispersion. We're talking serious rain. It just rains and rains and rains and washes everything away. I mean, if not the power washer aspect, it's the washing machine aspect. You imagine being in a washing machine for a couple of hours. It's kind of like that. And if you're still alive after the washing machine has finished its cycle, you're somewhere different. You're at the top of a drum. That's you're stuck to the top of a drum or something like that. And so that might be how it feels, but the I Ching says about dispersion is that it regards it as being positive. It clears things out, and you find yourself somewhere different because you've been moved on by the floodwater, and you might have been moved on in a good way. You might have been moved out of a dangerous situation, or your path may have been accelerated. Because the floods can move faster than you can run or walk, and so the flood picks you up and takes you sort of miles ahead. So suddenly you're ahead. So perhaps through your own actions, I talked about the dragon leaping. You do the leap, and straight away you might regret it because you realize what your leap has created. Your leap has created a storm. And the storm happens and you think you're done for, but when the storm settles, you perhaps realize that you made the right decision, all along. And now I want to finish by looking at Zohran Mamdani's horoscope. I know I've looked at it before. I'm not saying I'm going to say anything, suggesting that I'm going to say anything particularly original, anything that I haven't necessarily said before, but he has now been elected mayor of New York, and it's getting a huge amount of news coverage, across the world. And it is interesting because he's seen as this sort of new star. He's very young. Of course, he'll never be president. That's just not going to happen. He was not born an American. He was not born an American citizen. However well he does, the top position is always going to be denied to him, which I think is a bit unfair. If you become a citizen to a country, you should always have that possibility, however unlikely it is. I'm not an American citizen. I'm in America, but okay, obviously I'm never going to be in a position to be American president, but it's just that idea that even what's the point of becoming a citizen of a country if you can never become president, at least in theory. So I think that is a good reason, if you're not an American citizen, not to become an American citizen, because I think it's a bit of an insult, in my opinion, that you can never become an American president, if you even if you become an American citizen. Of course, I'm probably being sort of whimsical here, and it doesn't really matter. It's just a theoretical point. But if you're Mamdani, you could sort of feel quite hard done by the fact that the top position is always going to be denied to you. So going back to Mamdani's horoscope, I had a certain amount of uncertainty about his time of birth because I use the Astro.com website with their Rodden ratings. They have a rating about how accurate the time is, and when I first looked at his chart, it had an A rating, and it was at 1:15 p.m. and I thought that was good. Then I looked at it again, and it had gone. It was no longer an A rating. It was considered to there wasn't an accurate, a reliable time of birth. But I just looked at it again, and now it's got its A rating back. And so I think we can definitely say that Zohran Mamdani was born on October the 18th, 1991. So we're now looking at him in a different way. We now know that he is going to be mayor of New York. And mayor of New York, he doesn't have so much power. He can be as socialist as he like, but he's not like he's taking over a country. He can't sort of nationalize things. There's a limit to what he can do. And I'm not going to express any political opinions, by the way, when I talk about Zohran Mamdani. I mean, who knows? But if when we're talking about Zohran Mamdani, first of all, 1:15 a.m. That's important. I mean, his ascendant is, I make his ascendant 0 degrees 1 degree Leo. You could have slightly different coordinates for Kampala in Uganda, where he was born, and come up with 1 degree 10 degrees Leo. But the point is that if he was born any earlier, pretty much, he would have Cancer rising. So the question is, can we be sure? Can we be sure that he really does have Leo rising? I think in terms of the way he presents himself, he seems to be Leo rising. I think it's absolutely plausible that he has Leo rising. But we should still be open to the possibility that he actually has Cancer rising rather than Leo rising. You know, it's like with Donald Trump. Donald Trump is born with his ascendant, or at least the most popular time of birth for Donald Trump, you know, gives his ascendant 29 something Leo. But you know, if he was born any later, Donald Trump would be a Virgo. So we can't absolutely say that Donald Trump has got Leo rising. He might have Virgo rising, but Donald Trump and Mamdani, in their own ways, seem to show evidence of having Leo rising rather than Cancer rising in Mamdani's case, or Virgo rising with Trump. And so, you know, as far as you know, his chart is concerned, I mean, what must stand out with Mamdani's chart is that Mars-Saturn square. I mean, it is an incredibly close Mars-Saturn square, and it doesn't quite fit maybe with his image. It's tough having Mars-Saturn square. Everything is worked out perhaps in advance. I mean, you could say Mars-Saturn square is about frustration. Now, clearly in his case, things have run pretty smoothly for him. He came from, you know, his parents are sort of relatively well off. He sort of seemed to effortlessly go through the system, and he's now about to be mayor of New York. So it could be that one reason why this Mars-Saturn square is working so well is because Mars and Saturn are both in their own signs. So you've got Mars in Scorpio making a square to Saturn in Aquarius in its own sign. So maybe this is why it works so well. But when you're dealing with Mars Saturn, you know, it is a difficult aspect. It can be quite a planned aspect. That may be how it works. So, you know, don't be fooled by any easygoing image that Zohran Mamdani might have. I mean, I think that, you know, underneath, he clearly knows what he's doing, and there is very much a system here. And one thing about his Mercury-Mars square, which makes it extra powerful, not just the fact, he has got Mercury-Mars conjunction, and Mars-Saturn square is, you know, it's angular. He's got Mars on the IC, he's got Saturn on the descendant. So that Mars-Saturn square is really, really powerful. It really is, and of course Mercury is tied up with it, and he's quite a good orator. I haven't actually listened to any of his speeches, but apparently he's very effective. You know, he did quite well in his debate against Cuomo, and so he communicates well, and he's got Mercury on the IC. Now, you might say that Mercury on the IC is a hidden Mercury. You know, I did an interview, Annalene and the 8th house portal on the IC, where I talked about the IC, and I talked about different things on the IC, conjunct the IC. And one chart I briefly mentioned was that of Joe Rogan, and Joe Rogan has Mercury on the IC, and Joe Rogan is clearly an effective communicator, obviously. I mean, he has this incredibly successful podcast. He has Mercury on the IC, and it's just Mercury is made stronger just by being on an angle. And likewise with Zohran Mamdani, his Mercury in Scorpio doesn't sound particularly communicative, but it's conjunct the IC, that gives it strength. And even though it's square Saturn, doesn't matter. It's Mercury square Saturn may be someone who is an effective orator and who knows how to communicate. And he has got Mercury Mars conjunction, so he does really know how to express itself. Now, don't forget that Mars on the IC. I think that J.D. Vance has Mars on the IC, and Mars on the IC can be quite private, and there are possibly things about Zohran Mamdani's life that we don't know about, that he keeps secret, that one doesn't want to ask too many questions about. So that's what you should be perhaps thinking about with Mars on the IC. And it is a very serious chart. Don't be fooled by the lightness of it. This guy who's sort of popular and easygoing and whatever. Don't believe it. I'm not saying it as a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just saying don't be fooled. And he's got a Venus-Jupiter conjunction. So, Venus-Jupiter conjunction, it's a nice Venus-Jupiter conjunction. I mean, it's good to have Venus and Jupiter conjunct. These are, Jupiter is a greater benefic, Venus is a lesser benefic. You have a conjunction between them. That is fortunate, but don't forget that this Venus-Jupiter conjunction is in Virgo. Jupiter is in its detriment in Virgo. Venus is fallen in Virgo. And that doesn't mean to say that it's unfortunate. It instead means that it can be quite self-interested, or there can be some moral issue there. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. It's like, I don't want to really make the comparison. I'm not making a comparison here, but I'm just giving it as an example. It's like Hitler. He had a Moon-Jupiter conjunction, which must have, his Moon-Jupiter conjunction must have really helped him in terms of taking over Germany, becoming dictator. But his Moon-Jupiter conjunction was in Capricorn. So a Moon-Jupiter conjunction in Capricorn, where Jupiter, Moon and Jupiter, Jupiter is fallen in Capricorn, Moon is in its detriment. It works differently than if that Moon-Jupiter conjunction was in, say, Cancer. And likewise, with this Venus-Jupiter conjunction, it is fortunate because it helps him become successful, reach for heights, but there's something problematic about it. Perhaps it's too keen to be successful. Jupiter in Virgo, you think about Jupiter and Jupiter. Jupiter is about the big ideas, the big principles, where we want to go. And when it's in Virgo, does Jupiter really work very well in Virgo? It can be mean. It can be focused on itself. It can be focused on its agenda. And perhaps we can say the same thing about Venus. Venus is exalted in Pisces. Doesn't necessarily work so well in Virgo. So when you put Jupiter and Venus in Virgo, and you put it all together, you get the idea of someone who has powerful self-interest. And this is all about him. Don't forget that. I mean, this is not someone who is necessarily a great idealist. I think you'd be fooled if you were to think that. Of course, one can have a set of beliefs and do good or want to do good, but it's very easy to sort of mix up, one's own subjective views and one's own self-interest with what one is claiming to be able to do for society. So it's in a way, it's quite a frightening chart. But we shouldn't, let's not exaggerate here. Don't forget, he's never going to be president. That's not going to happen. And there's limits to what he can do, and I do think it is a strong chart. But if you were looking at this chart from a perspective of being, say, a conservative, an opponent of his, you're not believing in what he stands for, you could look at this chart, and it does certainly give you, a great deal of mileage as far as criticizing, who he is. And also, he's got Neptune in Capricorn, so he's got Venus and Jupiter in Virgo. I've just said that. And that other planet, which is Neptune, is supposed to be idealistic. Neptune in Capricorn. In fact, he's got North Node conjunct his Neptune. He's got true Black Moon Lilith conjunct his Neptune. So, Neptune in Capricorn is about, Neptune is about the ideals, wanting to let go of something larger than oneself. But how does Neptune possibly work in Capricorn? I know that Neptune does not have any how should I put it? It doesn't rule any signs, in my opinion. I'm a traditional astrologer, but I certainly remember reading a book when I started learning astrology, which I think it claimed that Neptune was exalted in Cancer. Well, that's an interesting idea. And if it's exalted in Cancer, it's fallen in Capricorn. And you can see the logic there. Because Capricorn is a very material sign. And it's, you try to transcend, but the transcendence is turned in on itself. What you are doing is you are taking advantage of other people's need for transcendence by focusing it all on you. And so for a politician, or perhaps a musician, I think a lot of, Taylor Swift, for example, I think Lady Gaga, they got Neptune in Capricorn. It all sounds very nice, getting people to transcend. But who gains? Who benefits? It's you who benefits. A person with Neptune in Capricorn, and of course that says something about a whole generation with Neptune in Capricorn. But it's difficult to make a generalization about Neptune Capricorn because so many people have it. But if you are a musician or you're a politician, you can see how you might use Neptune in Capricorn for your own interests. And so in that sense, you could argue that Neptune in Capricorn, was potentially quite dangerous. So as far as Mamdani is concerned, he's obviously been elected mayor. So the question people are asking is, how long is he going to last? Standard cynical view is, oh yeah, he's been elected, it's going to be a disaster. He's not going to last long, is he? People will get sick of him. The New York economy will collapse. So what next? And I have some ideas about what next, but let's start off by looking at what's actually going on for Mamdani at the moment. And so he had his birthday just before the election. So it's always good to look at his solar return. So the question is, which solar return do you look for? He was born in Kampala in Uganda. And it is this very common practice that people like to set a solar return for the place one is at, where one is when one has one's birthday. Now, I don't go for that because I don't think that one should really be able to avoid one's fate by moving to a different place just for one solar return. On the other hand, there's evidence both ways, and you have to ask, I can see. I I've looked at the example of, for example, Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi war criminal, who was kidnapped in Buenos Aires by the Israelis in 1960. You look at his solar return for where he was born in Germany, it's pretty unimpressive. But you look at it for Buenos Aires, it's completely incredible chart. Really does describe what happened. So looking at Zohran Mamdani's 2025 solar return set for Kampala, he has Jupiter on the midheaven. And Jupiter on the midheaven in Cancer, exalted in Cancer, that's a powerful signature of success. Also, you've got 1 degree Scorpio rising. He has got, let's just compare it with his chart. So if we compare the solar return, if we compare his solar return with if we compare the two charts, he's got a Mars-Mercury conjunction right at the beginning of Scorpio. So that rising degree set for Kampala is right on his Mars. Don't forget, he's got an incredibly strong Mars. He's got Mars in Scorpio. So that's the first point. And also, of course, he's got Jupiter on the midheaven. So as far as I'm concerned, this solar return, it's a powerful signature of a successful run to be mayor. Something big and good is very likely to happen following his 34th birthday. So if you reset his solar return for New York, it's really not. Is that his? If you set his solar return for New York, which I assume that's where he was at the precise time of his birthday, or when the sun returned to it was, it's an okay chart. You've got Jupiter on the ascendant, but it's not exactly on the ascendant. So I think with Zohran Mamdani, there is evidence here that that Jupiter rising is. There's evidence. There's evidence that one should use the place of one's birth, which was how it was done traditionally. If you look at, there was a 17th century astrologer, Gadbury. He looked at the horoscope of Charles I, and he would always use. He looked at lots of solar returns of Charles I. He would use the place of birth, not the place that Charles actually was. So let's run this thing forward. So that's the solar return. How's it going to work out? Well, we should look at the moment which there's a lot to say here, and I'm probably running out of time here. But here's the chart for when Mamdani becomes mayor. So he will become mayor on January the 1st of next year at noon. And so I believe it's at noon. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think that's when the ceremony is. And I don't think this chart is particularly spectacular. You might be interested in Chiron rising. Chiron rising, it might be the wound. The maverick might be what it's all about. If Chiron is the maverick, here is the maverick who has been elected mayor. He's going to want to do things differently. So that certainly fits. Also, we've got a Sun-Venus conjunction on the midheaven. That's not so bad, having a Sun-Venus. Well, the Sun is always going to be on the midheaven at the time the mayor is inaugurated. But Venus, I wonder about that Venus. Venus is conjunct the Sun. And you might then argue that Venus is weakened. So what might Venus represent? Venus could say something about his female supporters, conjunct the Sun. Is there an issue there? treatment of women in New York. So that is something that he would have to be careful about with that Sun-Venus conjunction. I mean, it's not a fortunate conjunction, that Sun-Venus. Venus is damaged, and you've also got Sun conjunct Mars. So you've got Venus, Sun, Mars conjunction on the midheaven, and I would have said that that's probably quite a bad signature for how it's going to work. This is not going to be an easy time for him as mayor. It's not going to be straightforward at all. And the question is, what is he going to do? And then if you look at his transits, when you look at Mamdani, given we now know he's mayor, thing to think about is his Mercury-Mars conjunction. That's going to get hit quite soon, relatively soon, in a few years' time, by Saturn. So the question is, what happens when Saturn goes into Taurus? So Saturn will go into Taurus quite soon. I mean, not immediately. And so Saturn goes into Taurus. It's for the first time. I think it's 2028. Saturn goes into Taurus in April 2028, and so Saturn will go over that Mercury-Mars conjunction. So that might be the first sort of big thing for him to worry about. So maybe the first couple of years will be okay, but come 2028, that may be a time when things really potentially start going wrong for him. Although, having said all this, he may have a certain amount of luck. And I'm just about to look at his Vedic chart, but I also looked at his primaries. So primaries, I do look at the primaries every now and then, and primaries is when you look at what happens as you move the axis of the Earth after birth. So, so 1 degree, for every degree that the Earth turns, you monitor the planets. You look at what they're doing. And one thing you'll notice about his chart is he's got this Venus-Jupiter conjunction. And his Venus-Jupiter conjunction is in the second house, but it's rising. I mean, it's rising towards the ascendant. And so the question is, when does that Venus-Jupiter conjunction reach the ascendant? So he is 34 years old. So if we turn the axis of the Earth 34 degrees, and we look at what the position is like, 34 degrees, it equates to just over 2 hours. I worked it out sort of exactly. So if we turn it 2 hours, if we go an hour and 2 hours and 16 minutes after he was born, which equates to the Earth moving 34 degrees because he's 34 years old, you can see that Venus and Jupiter, that conjunction, is moving towards his ascendant, but it's not quite there yet. So this might be 4 years, 5 years time, maybe something like this. So, but it's something important, that Venus Jupiter. So that's something we need to, that is something we need to bear in mind. I also did his solar arc directions. So his solar arc directions are here. So here are his solar arc directions, and if you look at his solar arc directions, we see Venus and Jupiter about to be activated by Saturn. You see, solar arc directed Saturn is at 4 degrees 35 Pisces. So it's not going to be for, say, 3 or 4 years before Saturn hits his Venus-Jupiter. So we have got a direction involving his Venus and Jupiter coming up in about 4 years' time. In about 4 years' time, we've also got Saturn making a solar arc directed aspect to his Venus-Jupiter. So the question is that Venus-Jupiter conjunction, when Venus and Jupiter, by primary direction, when it hits his ascendant, is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? Maybe it could be a bad thing because Venus and Jupiter are in Virgo, both poorly placed by sign, and we get a double Venus-Jupiter hit in a 4 years' time. So that kind of looks rather negative, maybe not immediately, but maybe after 2026 things will start to unravel. That's a possibility. On the other hand, what if we look at it from a different angle? What if we say look at it from a Vedic perspective? And so here is his Vedic chart. And so turning to his Vedic chart, well, one thing about his Vedic chart is he has got Saturn in the 7th house. And that means his Saturn has Dikbala. It has directional strength. It is strong in the 7th. His Saturn is in Capricorn in the 7th. And, I don't know where I got it from. I was sort of picked up on this. Where was the source for this view? But I don't know where I got it from. I'm sure I got it from somewhere. But Saturn in the 7th means that you can really stand up to your enemies. I mean, if you take Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, or she stayed in power for ages. Even when I never understood it. I never understood how she stayed as First Minister of Scotland for so long. But she had Saturn in the 7th, in Aries, in its fall. But and that perhaps is a testament to the power of Dikbala. And Zohran Mamdani, with this strong Saturn, means that he's not someone you take lightly. He can handle a great deal. Sure, he's got enemies, but he is absolutely not someone to be underestimated. And so that's one thing one has to make about a point one has to make about his chart. And when you're looking at a Vedic chart, you need to think about the periods of life, the dashas. We go through 9 dashas over the course of a life, assuming it lasts for 120 years. Over 120 years, we go through all the 9 dashas. And in 2016, his Jupiter dasha started, and his Jupiter dasha will last for 16 years until 2032. And so his Jupiter is one of the strongest planets in his chart, using the Shadbala system, which is a 6-fold way of evaluating planetary strength. Saturn is his strongest planet, Jupiter is his second strongest planet, and he has Jupiter in there is his Jupiter in his second house conjunct Venus. And so we know he's got a Jupiter-Venus conjunction because we looked at it from a Western perspective. Now, his Jupiter-Venus conjunction is not in Virgo in his Western chart, in his Vedic chart. It's in Leo. So we don't have to worry about them being fallen, or that's not an issue for us. And it's in the second house. And Jupiter, it's strong. Venus is not quite so strong, but so he's in a dasha which started in 2016, where Venus is conjunct his Jupiter, and he moved into the sub-dasha in March 2024, March of last year, March 6, 2024. He moved into his Jupiter Mahadasha and Venus sub-dasha, and when you've got a main dasha and a smaller dasha of 2 planets which are both conjunct in the horoscope, that can be very powerful for good or bad. And so his Jupiter Mahadasha, Venus subdasha completely coincides with that Jupiter-Venus conjunction. So you could really have said, when he was born, those couple of years from 2024, 2.5 years up until 2026 should be really good. And so certainly up until 2026, things are certainly looking good for him, and he stays in his Jupiter dasha for some time, and then in 2032 he moves into his Saturn dasha. So in 2032, which he'll still be pretty well. How old will he be? He'll be in his early 40s. He moves into his Saturn dasha. He's got a strong Saturn as well, and so his Saturn is not just Dikbala, it's in Capricorn, plus it's Vagatama. In other words, he has got... no, it's not Vagatama. Sorry, it's not Vagatama. Vagatama is when it's in the same sign in a Navamsha as in the main chart. But okay, it's in Aquarius in his Navamsha. It's in Capricorn in his main chart, but it's still in his Navamsha. I won't go into the details about the Navamsha. He's got Saturn in Aquarius, so that's pretty strong. And in his Navamsha, it's in the 7th house. So I think things are going to stay pretty good for Mamdani. I suspect he's going to be on the political scene for a long time, which suggests that maybe at least to begin with, things won't be so bad in New York. But given the power of all this, I would have said that Mamdani's goal should be to get out of New York as quickly as possible, and I think that that's what we should be looking for. I think that his problems are going to start, at least short term, with Saturn and Neptune. Neptune in the end, but certainly with Saturn making an opposition to his Mercury-Mars conjunction. He should be thinking about going to Congress, perhaps being a senator, whatever. He doesn't want to stay in New York for too long. I think that's probably something he should be thinking about. Probably he should regard New York as a good next step. But if he stays I suspect that if he stays in New York for too long, things could go wrong. And going back to his natal chart, going back to his Western chart, I should be finishing. I've already gone on for far too long. Going back to his Western chart, I wanted to just relocate his natal chart, born in Kampala, and if you relocate his chart for New York, that might give you some idea about his experience of New York, what New York is all about, and so if we relocate his chart to New York, we have a midheaven of 14 degrees 25 Capricorn. So Neptune is exactly on his midheaven in New York. And okay, it will probably be pretty close to the midheaven in Washington, but that's really telling you something about what it is. I mean, it's what it's all about. It's about his ability to transcend or appear to transcend, or I think it's more other people are transcending in terms of fitting in with his image, and so that's how perhaps Neptune Capricorn works. So maybe we're seeing how Neptune Capricorn is working very well, but it's not just Neptune that's on the midheaven. If you set his chart for New York, it's also true Black Moon Lilith, because he was born with a conjunction between Neptune and true Black Moon Lilith. So overall, I mean, I could say a lot more about Mamdani. I think he's got a very powerful chart. From a Vedic perspective, he is, I don't think, going away anytime soon. He's in his Jupiter dasha. It's working well. Obviously, his Jupiter dasha. In his early 40s, he moves into his Saturn dasha. I think his Saturn dasha could also work well. Although, whenever you get a new dasha, there can be a change of fortune. Maybe his Saturn dasha, maybe his Saturn is too strong. It sometimes does happen in Indian astrology. It seems strong on the paper, but it's maybe that is too much, and maybe that Saturn dasha could represent rivals, opponents, whatever. But I don't know. We'll have to talk about it closer to the date, if I'm still around by then. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. I'm sure I'll be talking about Zohran Mamdani again pretty soon. And if you enjoyed this video, I'd be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, I'd be super grateful if you were to subscribe. If you want to buy me a coffee, there's a link in the description. And I will talk to you again tomorrow.